Hello and welcome back to my channel. This is ziainspirations coming to you with a new video. I was really guided to do this video today. One of the topics that I want to mention this evening was mentioned in my last video, if anyone hasn't seen it yet, was dealing with grief. And so in that video I mentioned a few of the stages when dealing with grief. That a lot of us have to or do in different situations depending on the circumstances experience. For myself, as I'm recording this, I actually am dealing with one of those, and so I was just guided to do this video with those emotions, like the stage that I mentioned in that video. If someone hasn't seen it, I will go ahead and add a link to it if you are interested. So with that, it's dealing with denial. As I'm recording this, today was actually in the video I mentioned of grief. My grandfather just passed away. And so when I got home this evening, I was realizing that I was in a state of denial. I was trying to understand where I'm at. I was reflecting the day, and I was like, okay, this is what that is. So it's, at least I know. And it's completely normal. I think denial likes to, in dealing with grief when you've lost a loved one or dealing with different circumstances, whether it's a friendship or, depending on a relationship, it's normal for us to kind of go in that denial feelings, because I think that's just the way that our minds try and help us cope with the different emotions, to try and ease into it. I have dealt with grief, different situations. I explained the major one that I mentioned in that grief video that I talked about, but when dealing with a loved one that passed away, I was shocked how much, and I think how long I've been in denial. And a part of that, I reflect back to the fact that I wasn't able to go and see him when he passed away, and there's just other things, dealing with the little ones, trying to stay strong and everything like that around them. So in those kind of situations, as long as realizing what it is and then working with those stages. What I'm going to be talking about with this video is when it becomes unhealthy, when certain situations or things with people, including ourselves, where it becomes a really, really dangerous thing to be in denial when having a loved one that has an addiction problem. One thing is that I mentioned in that video the different stages and how a lot of us, we can be in those different stages for depending on our circumstances, for short times, longer times than others, or it could be reoccurring. People can stay in the feeling, the emotion, the stage of denial for a very, very long time, to where it becomes extremely, extremely unhealthy. And some may just choose to be in it forever if they choose to do so. So when dealing with denial, when dealing with someone that has an addiction, a lot of times the denial is very strongly with that loved one that has addiction. Sometimes, you might hear the phrase where they say I don't have a problem. And they full-heartedly believe it. That they do not have a problem, there's nothing wrong with them, and that you're the one that's crazy. That happens a lot. Others, it's when there's so much in denial, the fact that well, no one knows of what's going on with me, so it's not a problem to address because no one else knows about it. And so they're in their own denial within themselves. And that's where it becomes extremely dangerous. They stay in that denial until it starts becoming evident in their lifestyle, where it becomes proof like in their relationships, dealing with different situations, dealing with their homes, their work, finances, and they can still be in complete 100% denial that there's nothing wrong, that they do not have a problem. And a lot of that can also deal with dealing with loved ones around them in their situations, in their environment, where if other people in their environment is not seeing it as a problem and they're allowing the behaviors, then it can't be that bad, because nothing's really different. It depends on like the people in their environment that they are associated with, but it also deals with the manipulation, the boundaries, the enabling, the things that I mentioned on this channel, that if they do not have if the loved ones that are dealing with a loved one that has addiction do not have those certain tools at hand and are using them, then that is more fuel for the addiction to convince them that there's nothing wrong, that everything's fine. And it just fuels more of that denial. Other forms of denial is like where an individual, depending on what they are addicted to, they compare it with other forms of people with addictions or other people's lives. We do that a lot in the society, where we like to compare ourselves to other people and be like, okay, well, at least we're not like Susie and Bob, or like down the street, like we still have these certain things in place. And so we do a lot of comparison to try and make ourselves feel better with our own situations. And that goes along with people with addictions, where they're like, sure, I drink, but I'm not a drug addict. Yeah, sure, I do meth, but at least I don't do crack. Sure, I occasionally, I'll do cocaine, but at least I'm not a heroin addict. It's always like there's always that severe, and they will go down that list to convince themselves that their problem, there's issues, and these concerns are not concerns, they are not problems, and it just continues on feeling that denial. Where it gets really, really tricky, and I would say even more dangerous, is when you're dealing with someone that has an addiction problem, and they are what you would some describe as a functioning addict, or like a functioning alcoholic. In the addiction's mind, where the person that has an addiction problem, where they consider themselves as a functioning using under the substance, it's because they still have a job. They might still have a car. They're still able to pay their bills. They still have their families. They have a roof over their heads. And so those are a lot harder, because a lot of times in the society, for several decades, where it wasn't frowned upon in public eye or media or anyone until it got to that point where they didn't have all of those, like where they aren't able to hold a job anymore because the addiction has taken complete control over their lives. They're not able to pay their bills, are not able to keep a job or have a car, or they have a list of different issues with like law or something like that, and they, in other cases, they lost their families. And so when somebody has a true addiction and they still have all of the above, then to them, they don't have a problem, because they're still able to go to work. They're still able to function in a way to where they can justify themselves in this is sustainable. Like nothing's wrong. So if I'm still able to have this kind of stuff, then everything's okay. And that's, again, that denial. So that's dealing it with like the loved one that has the addiction. But dealing with the topics that I mentioned on this channel, I gear towards the families a lot. And the families can also be in that denial stage. And again, it can be for as however long that they choose to be so. And a lot of times the reasonings for that is dealing with like fear, where that is like a really, really strong emotion that can take control of anyone, and so just the fear of the thought of having a loved one that has an addiction problem, that can easily put somebody in that denial emotion, in that denial stage, to where it's just like, no, they don't have a problem, not so-and-so, there's no way. They came from a loving home, they have family that love them like we love them, and we have all of what life can offer, and no. And that's where that denial comes in. It's like where that goes back to like the comparison that I talked about earlier, where it was like we can be so fearful of judgment, of what others will think or say, being like, oh my gosh, what if this got word to like people that I work with? What if they found out? Or what if the family finds out? Or what if like the neighbors, or just add on to the list, like just fearful of that judgment of having someone, knowing someone that you care about that has an addiction that's very close to you. And so that can force that person to go into that denial, and being in denial themselves, being like, well, there's no way, or like, I'm so fearful of somebody finding out, or any of those kind of scenarios, and it just feels that denial more, to where they're not wanting to acknowledge the severity of the situation themselves either. And sometimes that comes into the fear of change. I think anyone that has experienced the topics that I mentioned on this channel, where they come into that realization of how severe the situation is, or they just found out about a loved one's addiction, that is like the day that your life will never be the same. There's no denial in that. But where it comes into like the denial of the fact of like not wanting to face it because of the fear of wanting it to change. What our perspective and how we thought our lives would be, and how we thought situations could or should be, like where it kind of comes into that form of control, where we start fighting it because we don't want that change, because we're trying to grasp on to the way that things were, the way that things should be, and the way that how things were supposed to be, and not in this nightmare that you just woke up to. That could put you into that form of denial. The definition of denial, it's the action of declaring something to be untrue. And so that goes back to the person, the loved one that has the addiction, and to the loved ones that, family, friends, that deal with this illness, where it's just, not Bobby. There's no way. Like he was the pro, football champion. Like he took the team to playoffs. He had, all like the beautiful girlfriends growing up. He had the wife. He had the wonderful job. There's no way, and came from a loving family, that sort of thing. But the one thing that this illness does not do is that it does not discriminate. It doesn't care who someone's background is. It doesn't care the reasonings. It doesn't care who or what it's attached to. This illness does not discriminate, and it will take hold of anyone, which is why we need to break out of being in that stagnant, unmoving, unchanging state. I mean, one of my first videos was, why aren't we talking more about this? I go into the statistics that are out there that are available, where I know for the past, 4 or 5 years, like those numbers and everything have substantially gone up and are completely different scenarios. Just recently, there's been some more articles, some more documentaries, things like trying to get the light on the topic, but people have to realize that if things don't start changing, it's going to get to the point where it's going to touch every single family. There's no family out there, there's going to be no household out there that hasn't or knows or deals with this illness. And so going into that fear, that change, that judgmental, those concerns, they're justifiable at the end of the day, but also at the end of the day, they're not, because it's we can't be fearful of what is. We can't be fearful of fear what other people think. That's, I think that I'm going to do a separate video on that, because it goes into the mentality of how a lot of when dealing with this illness, the fact that it is dealing with the mind and dealing with certain conditions and things that happen with the individual, and it still reflects back to the 3 C's, where didn't cause it, you can't control it, and you can't cure it. But it goes back to my other favorite quote, where it's if nothing changes unless something changes. And so it goes back to stepping back and facing up and saying, this is the reality, this is the situation, and be careful of that blame, because that's something else that I don't think a lot of people talk about, where when you have a loved one that has addiction, it's so easy to do the blame game. We hear it from our loved ones that have addiction, where they say they'll blame everything. They'll blame everything under the stars, the moons, of the reasonings why they do what they do. But the loved ones do that too, where it's well, if they just do this, they would get better. If they only do this one thing, they will do better. If it wasn't for fill in the blank, they wouldn't have, this problem in the first place. They wouldn't be addicted. And you go into that blame game, and it's completely normal. It is, in a sense, healthy. It goes into that grieving stage, where we go into that blame a little bit, where we try to put a finger in a blame, and at the end of the day, it's not going to fix the problem. Thinking that if your loved one could only do this one thing, then they wouldn't have a problem. If it was that easy, a lot of us wouldn't be dealing with a lot of the situations for as long as we have, and for the remainder of our loved ones' lives, more likely. Because it isn't unfortunately, with this illness, it's not just a simple if you just do XYZ, then everything will get better. It's not like that. No one can force and make a loved one stop using, and that's not what I focus on this channel. What I focus in on is dealing with the family that has a loved one dealing with the illness, and so that things that they can do that will make them better. And at the end of the day, it will help their loved one. But it starts with you first. That is the very most important thing that I mentioned in that on one of my very first videos, is that you have to take care of yourself. And so we have to pull ourselves out of the denial stage. We have to pull ourselves out of that blame stage. We have to not ignore it, because that kind of just goes right back, and we can flip right back to that denial. And that's the pattern that our loved ones that deal with this illness on a day-to-day basis can fall back into themselves, and it goes back to us too, where, you know, I mentioned, like, I always practice what I preach. Everything that I mention on this channel are things that have helped me in this process, in dealing with a loved one, dealing with for my family, you know, where we are at such a better place now than where we were when first found out about the addiction, and just being gentle and patient, you know, with yourselves as well on the progress that you are making, and just know that you are so strong, and then just to take it day by day. You guys, I'm sending all my love. I'm here for anyone. I have my contact information down below if anyone needs to feel the need to reach out. If you feel free to share your experiences, have others, you know, so that they can feel comfortable, because that's part of also like the process of being able to speak your truth, to speak what you're feeling and what you're, because that's, if you hold it in, you know, like that can also be dangerous as well, where you need to have a safe place. And so I strongly suggest to find a meeting in your area. I did do a Nar-Anon video on this channel that I talk about how Nar-Anon changed my life. Information's on there, like maybe some questions if you've never been to a meeting before, not giving up until you find that perfect one, because, you know, it's each one can have their own little energy, their own little vibe to it, and it's not to where it's like that spoon being fed down. It gives you the tools that I've used that have helped me, and that I know that will help others as well. So you guys, I hope this information has helped. Again, I'm here if you guys need anything, and I'm sending so much love. Take care.